Laughter followed her footsteps. Even the bailiff smirked. Then the judge raised a hand and said one word. "Stop!" The room froze, because what the judge had just noticed made this case anything but ordinary. They all saw a broken woman. Eleanor Vance walked into the Superior Court of San Francisco alone, a stark contrast to the phalanx of tailored suits surrounding her husband, tech mogul Julian Vance. Her simple linen dress was wrinkled, her hands empty of the binders and tablets his team brandished like weapons. She was a ghost in the temple of power and law, and the assembled spectators, junior associates, curious lawyers from other cases, even the court staff, responded with a wave of derisive whispers and muffled chuckles. This was the spectacle they'd come for, the swift, humiliating dismantling of the scorned wife. Julian, from his position at the defendant's table, allowed himself a faint, pitying smile. This was the final move in their 7-year marriage, a game he'd already won. He was here to enforce an ironclad prenuptial agreement, leaving her with nothing. His lawyers had crafted a narrative of a lazy, opportunistic spouse, and Eleanor, by appearing so utterly unprepared, was playing right into it. Eleanor didn't meet their eyes. She walked slowly to the plaintiff's table, a solitary island in the polished sea of the courtroom floor. She placed a single, thin manila folder on the table. The sound was a whisper against the marble. The judge, the Honorable Margaret A. Thorne, peered over her glasses, her expression one of weary impatience. Another day, another messy divorce. She lifted her gavel, ready to call the proceedings to order and begin the inevitable. But as her eyes swept the room, a detail snagged her professional attention. It was Eleanor's demeanor. It was a specific procedural marker tied solely to Eleanor's entrance and filing. Judge Thorne's gaze sharpened. She looked from Julian's confident, crowded table to Eleanor's profound isolation, then down to a particular line on her master docket. The air shifted. The judge's raised hand wasn't for the gavel. It was a command. "Stop." The single word, cool and precise, cut through the murmur like a blade. All laughter died. Julian's smile stiffened. His lead attorney, David Cross, mid-whisper, fell silent. Every head turned to the bench. Judge Thorne's eyes were now locked not on the powerful husband, but on the wife everyone had come to pity. She saw not a victim, but a plaintiff who had just triggered a rarely invoked, formidable rule of civil procedure. "Counsel," Judge Thorne said, her voice low but carrying to every corner, "approach the bench. Now." This wasn't a routine divorce hearing anymore. Eleanor Vance hadn't come unprepared. She had come armed with a legal scalpel, and with one silent, deliberate action, she had just severed her husband's entire strategy at its root. The real trial was about to begin. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button and comment where you are watching from. The laughter was a physical thing, a wave of humid contempt that hit Eleanor Vance the moment she pushed through the heavy oak doors of Department 518. It clung to her simple, oatmeal-colored linen dress, a stark, whispering contrast to the cold, marble silence the courtroom was supposed to command. Her flat-soled shoes made no sound, yet every eye tracked her lonely progress across the vast expanse of floor. The plaintiff's table, a vast acre of polished mahogany, awaited her like a desert island. She carried no briefcase, no stack of lever-arch files, only a single, slim manila folder held against her chest. A murmur, rich with derision, rippled through the packed gallery. "She doesn't even have a lawyer," it seemed to say. "This'll be over before lunch." From his throne at the defendant's table, Julian Vance watched his wife's approach with a mixture of pity and profound satisfaction. Flanked by his three-piece-suited legal sentinels, led by the notoriously sharp David Cross, Julian was the picture of prepared, moneyed inevitability. His own table groaned under the weight of document boxes, sleek laptops, and the quiet, confident energy of a team who billed by the 6-minute increment. He'd chosen his tie that morning, a subdued navy blue for its projection of sober responsibility. He was the reasonable one here, the captain of industry reluctantly forced to clean up a messy personal matter. Eleanor, with her wrinkled linen and empty hands, was the mess. David Cross leaned over, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Just remember, Julian, don't react. The narrative is established. She's the dependent, emotionally volatile spouse who contributed nothing and is now refusing to honor a clear, mutually signed agreement. Her appearance, well, it's doing half our work for us." A junior associate smothered a chuckle. Even the bailiff, a stern-faced man by the judge's bench, allowed a faint, dismissive smirk to touch his lips as Alina passed. This was the San Francisco Superior Court, where fortunes were divided and secrets dissected with clinical precision. They'd seen 100 Alina Vances, wide-eyed, overwhelmed, and ultimately steamrolled. Alina did not look at them. She didn't look at the gallery, where a few tech bloggers, smelling blood in the water, had already started live tweeting. Vance divorce, prenup win, bye-bye wife. Her gaze was fixed on the empty chair at her table. She pulled it out, the scrape of wood on stone echoing too loudly, and sat. She placed the manila folder squarely in front of her, aligning its edges parallel to the table. Then, she folded her hands in her lap and looked up, finally, at the bench. Her expression wasn't one of fear or defiance, but of a weary, patient focus. She looked like someone waiting for a train they knew was late, but would most certainly arrive. The Honorable Margaret A. Thorne entered with a rustle of black robes, and the room rose. Her reputation preceded her, impatient, intellectually formidable with a low tolerance for theatrics. She surveyed the scene with a single sweeping glance, the armored citadel of Julian's legal team, the solitary figure of Alina, and her mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. Another wealthy divorce. Another unequipped spouse about to be devoured. A waste of her court's time. "Be seated," she intoned, her voice dry as old paper. "Case number FD 2023784562, Vance versus Vance. I have the stipulated prenuptial agreement and the motion for summary judgment to enforce its terms before me. Mr. Cross, you may proceed with your opening statement. And let's be efficient, counsel. My calendar is full." David Cross stood, buttoning his $5,000 suit jacket with a practiced flourish. "Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court, this is, sadly, a straightforward matter. My client, Julian Vance, entered into his marriage 7 years ago with a clear and comprehensive prenuptial agreement, signed willingly by both parties after independent legal counsel." As Cross's smooth, sonorous voice filled the room, outlining a tale of protect-the-company pragmatism and a spouse's subsequent failure to uphold her end of a bargain, Alina's mind drifted not to the words, but to the origin of the document he held so reverently. It was in the old apartment, the one with the view of the bridge fog. Julian had just secured his second, seismic round of venture funding. He'd come home not with champagne but with a sheaf of papers. "The investors," he'd said, his hands on her shoulders, his face alight with a love that had felt then like the sun. "They need certainty, Ellie. It's just a piece of paper, a formality for them. For us, we're forever. This doesn't touch forever." He'd already made an appointment for her with a lawyer, a friend of his from Stanford. The lawyer had been nice, had explained the terms in a gentle voice. In the event of a dissolution, Alina would receive a capped, one-time sum not tied to the company's valuation. It was meant to be generous for a non-contributing spouse. "But you'll never need it," Julian had whispered that night, his lips against her temple. "You're my always." She signed the next day, her pen flowing with faith, not ink. The lawyer had been his friend. The terms, she now saw, were a beautifully crafted cage. "And as such," Cross concluded, his tone pivoting to one of gentle regret, "the petitioner has failed to establish any grounds for setting aside this valid contract. Her current lack of representation, while regrettable, does not alter the black-letter law. We move for the court to enforce the agreement and bring this unfortunate chapter to a close." Judge Thorne nodded, making a note. She then turned to Alina. "Ms. Vance, you are representing yourself today, is that correct?" Alina stood. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than Cross's, but it didn't waver. It was clear, like a bell heard from a distance. "Yes, Your Honor." "You understand the motion before the court? You understand that Mr. Cross is asking for a summary judgment, which means he believes there are no material facts in dispute, and that he is entitled to win as a matter of law." "I do, Your Honor." "And you oppose this motion?" "I do." Judge Thorne sighed inwardly. This was the part she dreaded. The unrepresented party, drowning in legalese, about to flail against a legal tsunami. "Very well, you may present your opposition." Alina did not pick up her folder. She did not launch into a tearful plea. Instead, she took a small, steadying breath and said, "Your Honor, before I address the substance of the motion, I wish to invoke, For the record and for the court's guidance, the protections afforded to me under California Rules of Court, Rule 5.92, and the broader principles encapsulated in the state's application of Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 17, c, regarding the court's duty to safeguard the interests of parties facing a significant disadvantage in litigation. The sentence hung in the air, perfectly formed, legally precise. David Cross's pen froze above his legal pad. One of the junior associates blinked. The gallery's whispering ceased. Judge Thorne's head lifted slowly from her notes. She peered over her glasses at Alina, then down at her own copy of the docket, then back at the woman standing alone at the table. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned Alina, the simple dress, the empty table, the calm, expectant face. She was not looking at a victim. She was looking at a procedural anomaly. "Explain," the judge said, her voice now devoid of its earlier impatience, replaced by pure, undiluted judicial focus. "The rule," Alina continued, "while often applied to minors or incapacitated persons, fundamentally exists to ensure equity when a vast imbalance of power and resources could prevent a fair proceeding. I am here pro se. The opposing party has, as you see, substantial legal representation. I believe the court has an affirmative duty, under these specific circumstances, to ensure the process itself does not become an instrument of unfairness." She paused, then delivered the line she had practiced in the mirror for weeks. "I do not ask for special treatment, Your Honor. I only ask that the court actively ensure the playing field is level, as the rules require." The silence that followed was profound. The smirk had vanished from the bailiff's face. Julian was staring at his wife as if she'd suddenly begun speaking in tongues. This was not his Alina. His Alina was the woman who curated their art collection, who planned their charity galas, who could discuss Byzantine architecture, but had once asked if LLC stood for long-term loving company. This woman was quoting civil procedure. Judge Thorne leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. The dynamic in the room had just undergone a seismic shift. A pro-se party invoking Rule 17c was rare. A pro-se party invoking it correctly, calmly, and as a preemptive shield was unheard of in her courtroom. It changed everything. It meant she couldn't just sit back and referee. It obligated her to intercede, to question, to slow the juggernaut down. David Cross's plan for a swift, surgical strike was just annihilated. "Counsel," Judge Thorne said, her gaze slicing toward David Cross. "Approach the bench, now, and Ms. Vance, you as well." As the three of them gathered in the hushed, tense space before the bench, the gallery straining to hear, Judge Thorne kept her voice low but iron-hard. "Mr. Cross, your client may have the right to enforce a contract, but this court has a non-waivable duty to ensure the process by which he does so is fundamentally fair. Ms. Vance's status triggers heightened scrutiny. Do you understand?" Cross, his face carefully neutral but a vein pulsing in his temple, nodded. "Of course, Your Honor, but the law—" "The law," Judge Thorne interrupted, "is not a bludgeon for the well-represented to wield against the unrepresented in my courtroom. Your motion for summary judgment is hereby denied without prejudice. We will proceed to a case management conference. I will be setting discovery schedules, and I will be overseeing them closely. I suggest you adjust your strategy accordingly, counsel. This is no longer a sprint." She turned her piercing gaze to Alina. "Ms. Vance, the court acknowledges your invocation of Rule 5.92 and its principles. The court will fulfill its duty. You will be afforded every reasonable latitude." "Thank you, Your Honor," Alina said softly. Back at the plaintiff's table, as the judge announced a recess, Alina finally sat down. Her hands, hidden under the table, were trembling, but it was the tremor of adrenaline, not fear. She had drawn first blood not with a shout, but with a citation. At the defendant's table, Julian had turned a pale gray. He grabbed Cross's arm as the lawyer returned, hissing, "What the hell just happened? What rule? She's not a lawyer." Cross was shuffling papers, a frantic, uncharacteristic motion. She cited a procedural safety net. She didn't attack the prenup, Julian. She attacked the process. She just turned the judge into her guardian. Our entire timeline is blown. He looked across the room at Alina, who was calmly making a note on the inside of her manila folder. For the first time, David Cross looked not pitying but wary. Who told her to do that? Leaner closed her folder. The label, written in her neat architectural script, was visible for a second. Vance v. Vance, Rule 17C, and equity jurisdiction. She hadn't come to beg, she hadn't come to cry. She had come quietly and alone to lay a trap. And the first and most powerful person in the room had just stepped into it. The laughter was gone, replaced by a buzzing, uncertain silence. The game, everyone now realized, had not even begun, and the rules were just rewritten. The air in the courtroom had changed. It was no longer the thin, anticipatory atmosphere of a public execution, but the thick, charged quiet of a chess match where the underdog has just made a startling, irrevocable opening move. The recess was over. Judge Thorne settled back onto the bench, her demeanor transformed from impatient overseer to active, vigilant arbiter. She looked at David Cross with new eyes, no longer just as counsel for the moving party, but as a potential wielder of disproportionate force. "Counsel," Judge Thorne began, her voice crisp. "Given the court's duty under Rule 5.92, we will proceed to a case management conference. Ms. Vance, do you have a preliminary list of discovery requests?" Leaner stood. She opened her manila folder and extracted a single sheet of paper. "I do, Your Honor. I submit them now." She handed a copy to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge and another to David Cross. Cross scanned it, his brow furrowing deeper with each line. It wasn't the typical scattershot plea for all financial documents. It was surgical, specific, and unnervingly knowledgeable. "Your Honor, objection," Cross said, the words automatic but lacking their earlier force. "This is a phishing expedition. Petitioner requests access to private corporate server logs, specific email chains between my client and his CFO from a 3-year date range, the complete capitalization table for Vance Technologies showing all historical revisions, and most outrageously, the administrative access logs and data from the smart home system in the marital residence. This is a gross invasion of privacy, and far beyond the scope of a divorce proceeding." Judge Thorne put on her glasses and read the list. She looked at Leaner. "Ms. Vance, justify these requests, particularly the smart home system. This is unusual." Leaner's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained that same clear, distant bell. "Your Honor, the prenuptial agreement's validity hinges on the premise of full financial transparency and good faith entered into at the time of signing, and the conduct of the parties during the marriage. Respondent's counsel has painted a picture of me as a non-contributing spouse. My requests aim to establish the true nature of my contributions, both professional and personal, which have direct bearing on the equity of the agreement's enforcement. The corporate data is to trace the diversion of marital assets and the intentional obfuscation of company value. The emails are to establish intent." "In the house," the judge pressed. "The marital residence was not just a home, Your Honor. It was, for 7 years, the de facto headquarters for Mr. Vance's networking, client entertainment, and philanthropic fundraising. Its management was my primary operational responsibility. The system logs will show the scope and scale of that work, security protocols for high-profile guests, climate and lighting schedules for events, inventory management for staff. Furthermore," she paused, a beat of perfect, deliberate silence, "in a matter where personal conduct and credibility are at issue, the system may contain relevant data about comings and goings that contradict sworn statements." A ripple went through the gallery. She wasn't just asking for bank statements, she was asking for a digital reconstruction of their life. Julian's jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle flickered in his cheek. He leaned over and whispered frantically to Cross, "The Alexa logs in my study, the motion sensors. She can't have those." Judge Thorne considered. The requests were broad, but they were not unintelligent. They were targeted arrows shot toward specific legal arguments a pro-C party shouldn't be able to formulate. "The court finds the requests relevant to the issues of contribution, asset valuation, and potentially conduct. Objection overruled. Mr. Cross, you will comply. I will appoint a special master, a forensic IT expert, to oversee the collection of the digital data to ensure it is complete and unaltered. All costs will be borne by respondent, pending final allocation." It was a body blow. Julian's team had just lost control of the narrative and the timeline. They were now on the defensive, ordered to hand over the keys to their own digital kingdom. Flashback, the awakening. The discovery hadn't come in a tearful confrontation or a found lipstick on a collar. It had come, for Alina, the way all true architectural revelations did, through a crack in the facade. It was a rainy Tuesday, 18 months ago. She was finalizing the seating chart for the Vance Foundation's annual gala, cross-referencing dietary restrictions with donation tiers. Julian's shared calendar, glowing on her tablet, showed him in back-to-back meetings in the city. A notification popped up, a reminder for a meeting she didn't recognize. Asset realignment, 2 p.m. the Linden. The misspelling, realignment, jumped out at her. Julian was a tyrant for correct spelling. She tapped it. It was on his private, encrypted work calendar, but she still had shared access. The location was a boutique hotel in Pacific Heights, not his office. A cold, quiet curiosity settled over her. This was her skill, honed through years of studying fragmented blueprints and historical records, reconstructing the whole from anomalous details. She didn't confront him. She began to observe. The misspelled meeting recurred every Thursday. She checked their shared credit card, no charges at the Linden. He was paying in cash or it was being paid for. One Thursday, she told him she was spending the day at the Museum of Modern Art. Instead, she parked a block away from the Linden. At 2:15 p.m., she saw Julian's black Tesla glide into the underground valet. Her heart didn't break then. It simply turned to stone. At 4:50 p.m., he emerged not alone. With him was Lillian Thorne, his chief operating officer, a woman whose sharp elegance and fierce loyalty to the company had always been praised. They were not touching, but the intimacy and the space between them, the relaxed set of Julian's shoulders, spoke volumes. They got into his car together. Alina drove home, the rain blurring the city into a gray watercolor. She felt no rage, only a profound, chilling clarity. The marriage was a ruin, but she was an architectural historian. She knew how to document a ruin before it was looted or demolished. She began her own silent discovery process. She made copies of every financial document left in the home office. She used her administrative access to the home server to ensure it was backing up continuously to a private, encrypted cloud she paid for with a secret account. She started a journal, not of feelings, but of facts. Dates, times, discrepancies, the slow financial strangulation as her household budget was cut, her credit limits reduced, all while Julian's public wealth skyrocketed. She was building a case brick by digital brick. Courtroom Session 2. 2 weeks later, the discovery process was underway, and the special master had delivered the first tranche of data. David Cross stood to depose Alina. He had to try to re-establish dominance, to paint her as the bitter, scavenging ex. "Ms. Vance," he began, oozing a synthetic sympathy. "You've stated you contributed to the marriage. Can you describe, in your own words, what your typical day entailed?" Alina met his gaze. "There was no typical day, Mr. Cross. It was a portfolio of responsibilities. It involved managing a staff of 4 for a 12,000-square-foot residence, which served as a regular venue for high-stakes corporate and philanthropic events. This required logistics, vendor contracts, and budgeting. It involved curating and managing a 7-figure art collection, including insurance, conservation, and loan agreements to museums, which enhanced my husband's social capital. It involved planning and executing over 24 fundraising galas for the Vance Foundation, which raised a net total of $47 million during the marriage and provided significant tax advantages and PR value for Vance Technologies." Cross blinked. He was expecting "I made his coffee" or "I kept a lovely home." He was getting a CEO's summary of a nonprofit enterprise. "I see, and you're claiming this was essential work." "I'm claiming it was unpaid labor that directly supported and enhanced my husband's financial, social, and professional standing, thereby increasing the value of the marital partnership which the prenuptial agreement now seeks to negate." Her language was pristine, legalistic. She was speaking the court's language. Frustrated, Cross shifted. "Let's talk about the company itself. You claim you contributed to Vance Technologies. Did you ever hold a title, receive a paycheck?" No, my contributions were informal and uncredited. Ah, Cross said, a hint of his old smirk returning. So they are unverifiable, subjective. Eleanor turned to Judge Thorne. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to reference Exhibit 12 from the Special Masters production. The judge nodded. A screen flickered to life. Eleanor, using a wireless clicker, brought up an image. It was a scan of a whiteboard covered in fluid sketches and notes. This is a photograph from the server backup of my personal laptop, dated April 14th, 7 years ago. The metadata confirms it. It shows a user flow diagram for the original Vance Connect app interface. The handwriting is mine. The notes on iconography and user navigation, too cluttered here. Funnel users to premium tier here are in my hand. She clicked. Another image appeared, a sleek modern app interface. This is the launched version of Vance Connect. You can see the translation of those notes into the final design. I was the user experience consultant. Julian called me his secret weapon then. He stopped saying that when the funding rounds got bigger. The gallery was dead silent. Julian had gone pale. He remembered that whiteboard session. He'd called it pillow talk with purpose. Cross was floundering. This is a single anecdote years old. It establishes a pattern of contribution, Eleanor said calmly. Then she dropped the hammer. Your Honor, I would now like to introduce evidence relevant to respondents' credibility and conduct, which bears on the good faith element of the prenuptial agreement. Before Cross could object, she brought up a new document on the screen, a complex spreadsheet of timestamps and data codes. This is an extract from the administrative log of the marital home's smart system, specifically for the study on the second floor, which was Mr. Vance's private workspace. I've correlated it with his published calendar entries for the last 36 months. She highlighted a row. On Thursday, November 12th, his calendar stated board dinner prep, 7 p.m. to midnight at office. The home system log shows that in his study, the Amazon Alexa device played ambient jazz from 6:45 p.m. to 11:58 p.m. Motion sensors in the room were triggered only twice after 7:15 p.m., likely by a cleaning person. His car's GPS data, which the special master also obtained, shows the vehicle stationary at the underground garage of the Linden Hotel from 6:30 p.m. to 11:45 p.m. She looked at Julian. You weren't at the office. You were at a hotel for over 5 hours on a school night. The gasp from the gallery was audible. This wasn't just dry financials. This was a real-time digital unmasking. She clicked again, showing a cascade of similar Thursday night discrepancies. I have 37 such instances logged over 3 years, Eleanor said, her voice finally betraying a sliver of ice. The pattern contradicts any sworn statement Mr. Vance might make about his commitment to the marriage or his transparency. If he will lie about where he was, what will he lie about concerning the money? David Cross was on his feet, shouting an objection about relevance and privacy, but the dam had broken. Judge Thorne's face was grim. She held up a hand, silencing Cross. She looked from the damning data on the screen to Julian, who seemed to be trying to disappear into his expensive suit. The evidence is admitted, Judge Thorne said quietly, the weight of the revelation settling over her bench. Its relevance to the character and credibility of the parties, and by extension the context in which the prenuptial agreement is being enforced, is clear. She turned to Cross. Your client's conduct, counsel, has just become very much an issue in this case. The plot, as they say, thickens. As the judge called for another recess, Eleanor sat down. Her hands were steady. She had done more than defend herself. She had gone on the attack. She had exposed the rotten core of the marriage with the cold, hard light of data. Julian wasn't just a businessman enforcing a contract. He was a perjurer in the making, caught by the very technology he worshipped. Across the room, Julian stared at his wife, not with anger anymore, but with dawning, horrified realization. She wasn't the historian of dead things. She was the forensic architect of his downfall, and she had just shown him the blueprint. The recess after Eleanor's digital ambush was a study in contrasting silences. On her side of the room, the quiet was one of intense, humming focus. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her eyes on the single sheet of paper before her, a printed copy of the specific clause from the prenuptial agreement she had referenced. She was a diver holding her breath before plunging into the deepest, coldest part of the wreck. On the other side, the silence was a chaotic vacuum, filled with the frantic, hissed whispers of a legal team in panic. Julian Vance had shattered. The cool, tech mogul facade had crumbled into raw, pale anxiety. "She can't use that," he rasped at David Cross, his voice trembling with a rage born of utter exposure. "The hotel logs, the car data, that's private. It's illegal. You told me this was about the money, about the contract." "It was," Cross hissed back, shuffling through notes with a jerky, uncharacteristic motion. His own calm had been incinerated by Aliner's surgical strike. "She's changed the battlefield. She's making it about you, about your conduct. The judge is looking at you like you're a forger now, not a CEO." He shot a glance at the gallery where the tech bloggers were typing furiously. The headline had already pivoted from prenup drama to Vance secret hotel nights exposed in court. "We need to settle this now, before the forensic accountant digs any deeper." The judge's return was met with a courtroom so tense it felt brittle. Judge Thorne did not sit down immediately. She stood at the bench, her hands resting on the polished wood, and let her gaze sweep the room, finally landing on Julian. It was a look of profound judicial disappointment. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice low but carrying a whiplash intensity, "I feel compelled to remind all parties that this court operates under the auspices of truth. Attempts to obscure the truth are an affront to this institution. Counsel," she said, turning to Cross, "you will ensure your client understands that his credibility is now a central issue. Proceed." Cross, visibly chastened, stood. He had to reclaim something, anything. "Your Honor, the petitioner's display, while emotionally charged, does not alter the foundational document at play. The prenuptial agreement is a contract. Its terms regarding financial separation are clear and were entered into voluntarily. Ms. Vance's attempts to smear my client's character, however salacious, are irrelevant to the enforceability of that contract." It was the wrong word. Aliner's head lifted slowly. "Smear." Judge Thorne caught the tone. "Ms. Vance." Aliner stood. She did not look at Cross. She addressed the judge. "Your Honor, credibility is the foundation of any contract, especially one predicated on good faith, as marital agreements are. But Mr. Cross has again raised the contract itself. With the court's permission, I would like to direct the court's attention to the specific clause within the prenuptial agreement that my previous line of questioning was building toward." "Proceed." She picked up her paper. "Section 4, subsection B, it states, 'Both parties hereby affirm, under penalty of perjury, that they have made a full, complete, and accurate disclosure of all assets, liabilities, and income streams to one another prior to the execution of this agreement, and covenant to continue such full financial transparency throughout the duration of the marriage.'" She looked up. "This is the full transparency clause. It wasn't just a one-time disclosure for the signing. It was a continuing covenant, a promise, a vow within a vow." She turned now to face David Cross, and her voice, for the first time, took on an edge of steel. "My discovery requests for corporate emails and server logs were not a fishing expedition, counsel. They were a direct inquiry into whether that continuing covenant was honored." She turned back to the bench. "Your Honor, I would now like to introduce Exhibit 22, an email chain obtained through the special master, dated January 15th of last year. It is between Mr. Vance and his chief financial officer, Alan Peck." The screen lit up again. The email headers were clear. From Julian Vance to Alan Peck. Subject, Q4 projections and shadow ledger. A fresh wave of murmurs erupted. Shadow ledger. Cross was on his feet, objecting violently, claiming attorney-client privilege proprietary business information. But the special master, a neutral officer of the court, had already vetted the chain for relevance. Judge Thorne's eyes were glued to the screen. "This was obtained through proper channels, counsel. Overruled. Continue, Ms. Vance." Aliner's finger on the clicker trembled slightly. This was the heart of it, the real betrayal. She zoomed in on the text of Julian's email. "Alan, attached are the real Q4 numbers. The ones we show the board need to reflect the R&D write-down we discussed. Keep the attached set, call it Project Aegis, completely separate. This is for our eyes only. We cannot have the true margins visible to anyone, not even the senior team, especially not spouses on the cap table. This is critical for the re-IPO valuation later. Full opacity is required. The word opacity seemed to burn on the screen, a direct, violent antonym to the full transparency promised in the prenuptial agreement. There are 17 similar emails over a 3-year period, Alina said, her voice thick with a pain she could no longer fully suppress. They detail the creation of a dual accounting system. They discuss intentionally depressing the company's apparent profitability through fictional R&D write-downs and consulting fees paid to offshore entities. They explicitly state the goal, to depress the valuation of what would be considered marital property while hoarding the true value in a shadow ledger for a future liquidity event after the dissolution of the marriage. She turned to Julian, who looked physically ill. You weren't just hiding from me. You were architecting a fraud against our partnership, against the contract you insisted upon. The courtroom was in an uproar. Judge Thorne did not quiet it immediately. She was reading the emails herself on her monitor, her face hardening into a mask of judicial fury. When she finally slammed her gavel, the crack was like a gunshot. Order, order in this court. The silence that followed was absolute, stunned. David Cross was pale. Your Honor, this is a complex business strategy, taken out of context. Do not insult this court's intelligence, Mr. Cross, Judge Thorne snapped, cutting him off. Her gaze was volcanic. The term shadow ledger is not a term of art for legitimate business strategy. Full opacity is required is not a phrase used by someone honoring a covenant of full financial transparency. This goes beyond marital misconduct. This is a prima facie case of an attempt to fraudulently induce a continuation of the marital agreement under false pretenses and to systematically devalue the marital estate. You built your entire case for summary judgment on a foundation of sand. Worse, on a foundation of deliberate concealment. She turned her fury on Julian, who seemed to have shrunk in his chair. Mr. Vance, you swore to tell the truth in this proceeding. You sought this court's authority to enforce a contract that your own emails reveal you were actively undermining. This is not just bad faith. This is a breathtaking contempt for the entire legal process. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to master her anger. Based on this evidence, the court is now considering, sua sponte, imposing sanctions under Code of Civil Procedure 128.5 for actions pursued in bad faith, actions that are frivolous and solely intended to cause unnecessary delay. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the California Department of Justice for potential investigation into financial fraud. Your motion for summary judgment is not just denied, Mr. Cross, it is eviscerated. The final word hung in the air, final and devastating. Flashback, the silent partner. In the echoing silence of the judge's condemnation, Alina's mind flashed back, not to a moment of betrayal, but to a moment of creation. It was the old garage, the literal one before the venture capital, before the penthouse. The air smelled of solder and ambition. Julian was stuck, whiteboarding a chaotic mess of features for his app. It's a cluttered mess, Jules, she'd said, wiping her hands on her jeans. She'd taken the marker from him. Look, the user is here, they want to connect. Everything else is noise. She'd drawn a clean, elegant funnel, simplifying the chaos into an intuitive flow. You guide them here. The premium feature isn't a button, it's the natural next step. Julian had watched, his eyes wide with revelation. He'd grabbed her and spun her around. You're a genius, you're my secret weapon. He'd meant it then. The secret weapon. She had seen the structure he could not. Now she had used that same skill to see the fraudulent structure he had built to bury her. End of session, the settlement offer. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Julian was a ghost. The color had not returned to his face. David Cross approached Alina, who was calmly placing her single folder into a plain tote bag. Ms. Vance, Cross said, all professional patina gone, replaced by a strained, pragmatic urgency. A word, in private. They stepped into a small conference room. Julian did not follow. He couldn't look at her. My client, Cross began, is prepared to make a substantial offer. We will set aside the prenuptial agreement. You will receive 50% of the current valuation of Vance Technologies as represented in our last Series F funding round. That is a figure in the mid-9 digits, plus the penthouse. A clean break. All of it contingent on a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a public statement that this was an amicable parting, and that the emails were simply misunderstood business jargon. Eleanor listened, her expression unreadable. She looked out the small window at the San Francisco skyline, at the towers Julian so desperately wanted to be among. She thought of the shadow ledger, the planned opacity, the hotel rooms, the years of being treated as a decorative, non-essential fixture. She turned back to David Cross. No. He blinked. I beg your pardon, the number is. The number is a bribe for my silence, she said, her voice quiet but absolute. It's an attempt to put a price on the truth, to keep Project Aegis in the shadows. I am not interested in his money on his terms. Eleanor, for God's sake, be reasonable. The use of her first name was a measure of his desperation. You've won, take the victory. I haven't won yet, she said, picking up her tote. Winning isn't a check and an NDA. Winning is a judgment. Winning is a public record that states unequivocally what he did. The truth isn't something I'm willing to settle for. It's the only thing I want from him. She walked out of the conference room, leaving David Cross standing alone, staring at the void where his airtight case had once been. Eleanor didn't head for the exit. She walked back toward the courtroom, where the clerk was still tidying up. She needed a moment of quiet in the space where the truth had finally, explosively, been heard. The real trial, the one about consequences, was just beginning. The weeks between the exposure of the shadow ledger and the final hearing were a suspended, breathless quiet, like the city holding its breath before a quake. The courtroom victory was Pyrrhic in the public eye. Headlines screamed, Vance Empire built on lies. The SEC opened a formal inquiry, and Julian's board forced him into a leave of absence. But for Eleanor, the real work was just beginning. The forensic accountant's report had landed with the thud of a tombstone. Julian, Project Aegis, had siphoned over $200 million of true profit into labyrinthine offshore vehicles. The marital estate, as defined by his manipulated numbers, was a hollow shell. The prenuptial agreement's capped payout was a cruel joke. David Cross, desperate to avoid the scorched earth trial Judge Thorne now seemed intent on presiding over, filed a flurry of motions, to seal the financial records, to exclude the emails as prejudicial, to bifurcate the issues, the affair from the finances. Judge Thorne denied them all with terse, scathing endorsements. The court finds the evidence of a unified pattern of deceit and bad faith to be inextricable, she wrote in one ruling. The playing field wasn't just level. It had become a cliff, and Julian was clinging to the edge. The day of the final hearing dawned gray and still. The gallery was packed tighter than before, but the atmosphere was different. No one smirked. No one whispered jokes. There was a reverent, almost fearful silence. They weren't here for a spectacle anymore. They were here for a verdict, for justice. Eleanor entered, once again alone. She wore a simple, dark navy dress, a color of depth and authority. The solitary manila folder had been joined by a small, neat stack of bound pleadings. She looked, for the first time, not like a victim or a supplicant, but like an officer of the court. Julian entered with his team, but the phalanx had shrunk. David Cross was there, but 2 of the junior associates were gone, their billable hours no longer justifiable. Julian himself looked diminished, aged a decade and a month. The elegant suit hung on him slightly. He kept his eyes on the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the room, of the judge, of his wife. Judge Thorne took the bench. She dispensed with all preamble. This is not a trial on the facts. The facts, as presented through discovery, are largely uncontested. This hearing is to determine equitable division and the validity of the prenuptial agreement in light of those facts. Mr. Cross, you may proceed with your final argument, but be advised the court's patience for obfuscation is at an end. Cross stood. His argument was a retreat, a plea for minimal mercy. He spoke of business pressures, of complexities misunderstood by a non-expert spouse, of Julian's substantial contributions to building the company. He urged the court to enforce a modified version of the prenuptial agreement, offering a percentage slightly above the cap. It was a speech made of ash, and it fell to the floor, lifeless. "Ms. Vance," Judge Thorne said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "Your final argument." Alina rose. She did not approach the lectern. She stood at her table, her hands resting lightly on the wood, and she spoke directly to Judge Thorne, woman to woman, citizen to arbiter. "Your Honor," she began, her voice filling the quiet room without strain, "for 7 years I believed my vow was the most important contract I would ever enter. For better, for worse. I understood that. For richer, for poorer. I accepted that. The vow I made was one of mutual good faith. It was the foundation." She paused, letting the ancient words hang in the modern, sterile air. "The document my husband now clings to was, he told me, a formality, a piece of paper for outsiders. But it contained a clause, a covenant, of full financial transparency. Not once. Continuously. He presented that clause to me as a redundancy because our trust was absolute. I now know he saw it as a loophole. A clause he could sign with one hand while, with the other, he typed emails ordering full opacity." She picked up a single sheet, the email with those very words. "This is not a business strategy. It is the antithesis of a vow. It is the systematic dismantling of the very foundation upon which the marriage, and by extension this ancillary agreement, was built. He didn't just break his promise to me. He weaponized the promise itself. He used the appearance of a contract to perpetrate a fraud." She set the paper down. "The law has terms for this. Fraud in the inducement. Unconscionability. They are cold terms. What they mean in this room today is that a contract predicated on a lie is no contract at all. It is a forgery. To enforce any part of it would be for this court to become an accessory to that lie." She turned now slowly to look at Julian. He finally raised his eyes. In his face, she saw not the charismatic visionary, but the scared boy who was terrified of being exposed, of being less than. For a fleeting second, she felt not anger, but a vast, oceanic sadness. "He asks the court to consider his contributions," she said, turning back to the judge. "I do not deny them. He built a company, but I ask the court to consider mine. I built the ecosystem that allowed the builder to thrive. I was the host, the curator, the strategist, the secret weapon. And then, when I was no longer useful, I was recategorized as a liability, an expense on a shadow ledger. My contributions were erased with a keystroke, just as our partnership was." Her voice grew stronger, ringing with conviction. "This is not about punishing success, Your Honor. It is about honoring contribution. It is about affirming that good faith is the bedrock of any agreement, especially a marital one. To give him what he wants, to allow him to buy my silence with a fraction of what he hid, would be to tell him, and every person in a position of power like him, that the vows are just words, that the contracts are just games, that opacity wins." She took a final, steadying breath. "I am not asking for a reward. I am asking for restoration. I am asking this court to tear up the forged document and look at the true ledger, the one he tried so hard to keep in the shadows, and divide what was, in truth, built together. I am asking for the court to validate that the most valuable asset in any marriage, in any partnership, is not money. It is trust. And when that is deliberately and calculatingly destroyed, the law must offer more than a slap on the wrist. It must offer a reckoning." She sat down. The silence was total. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seat. It was as if the entire room had stopped breathing. Flashback, the last straw. The night before she filed the petition, Alina had not packed a bag or called a friend. She had gone to the De Young Museum, to the Hall of Architectural Fragments. It was late. A private donor viewing. She stood before a massive, weathered stone capitol from a Romanesque cathedral. The docent spoke of how it once bore unimaginable weight, how its precise carving and integrity allowed arches to soar. It was cracked now, a museum piece, but its purpose was still legible in every groove. She thought of Julian's new headquarters, the Vance Tower downtown, a shimmering spike of glass and light. It was featured in magazines for its innovative, earthquake-resistant base isolation system, a building designed to withstand tremors by physically separating itself from the shaking ground. That was his masterpiece, she realized. Not connection, but isolation. Not a foundation of stone, but a mechanism for detachment. She had built her life on what she thought was a cathedral vow. He had built his on a base isolator, a system to ensure that when the quakes came, he could float above the damage untouched. Her final realization was cold and clear. She was not his foundation. She was part of the ground he was engineered to escape. She left the museum and went home to the penthouse. She sat at Julian's abandoned desk, opened his premium drafting software, and began to draw, not a building, a flowchart. A clean, logical, devastating map of the discovery process, starting with Rule 17C. It was her own architectural plan for demolition. Julian's unraveling. After Aliner's argument, Judge Thorne called for a short recess. In the hallway, Julian finally broke. He approached Aliner, his guards down, David Cross hovering helplessly behind him. "Ellie," he whispered, the old nickname a hollow echo. "Please, you've made your point. You've destroyed me. Isn't that enough? Take the settlement. Let me have something left." She looked at him, her eyes clear of the sadness now, empty of everything but finality. "You had everything, Julian. You had my trust. That was the something. You chose to convert it into a line item on a hidden ledger. You don't get to have it back, and you don't get to negotiate its value now. The court will decide what's left." When they reconvened, Judge Thorne's expression was solemn, resolved. "The court has heard the arguments. The evidence is clear and convincing. The respondent, Julian Vance, engaged in a prolonged, deliberate scheme to conceal assets, directly breaching the covenant of good faith and full transparency that was intrinsic to the prenuptial agreement. This constitutes fraud in the inducement of the continuation of that agreement, rendering it procedurally and substantively unconscionable." She adjusted her glasses. "Therefore, the prenuptial agreement is void in its entirety. The court turns to the equitable division of the marital estate. Using the valuations provided by the court-appointed forensic accountant, which this court finds credible, the true marital estate is valued at $428 million. A number, solid and real, now filled the air where lies had been. California is a community property state. Petitioner, Aliner Vance, is awarded one half of the marital estate, $214 million. Additionally, due to the respondent's oppressive, fraudulent conduct and his litigation in bad faith, the court awards 100% of the title to the marital residence on Telegraph Hill to the petitioner, free and clear, as a punitive sanction. Respondent is also ordered to pay all of petitioner's forensic accounting and special master fees, as well as a contribution toward her future legal costs, totaling $5 million. She looked down at Julian. "Mr. Vance, you sought the protection of a contract while systematically violating its core principle. The law is not a tool for such gamesmanship. You have not only lost this case, you have forfeited the trust of this court. Judgment will be entered accordingly." She brought down the gavel. Crack. The sound was not loud, but it was absolute. It was the sound of a world ending and a new one beginning. Julian slumped forward, his head in his hands. David Cross began mechanically gathering papers, his face a blank mask of professional defeat. Aliner did not move. She let the silence settle around her. She felt no surge of triumph, no elation. She felt a profound, echoing quiet like the stillness in the museum hall after the docent stopped speaking. It was done. The structure had been examined, condemned, and justly dismantled. She gathered her folder and her stack of pleadings. She did not look back at the ruin of her husband. She walked out of the courtroom, her footsteps the only sound in the vast, attentive silence. She had not just won a verdict. She had won back her own narrative, and in the echoing quiet, she could finally begin to hear the sound of her own thoughts again. The morning fog clung to the city with a gentle persistence, softening the hard edges of the skyline, turning the world into a monochrome dreamscape. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of what was now indisputably her penthouse, Aliner watched the gray tendrils curl around the spire of the Transamerica Pyramid. The silence was no longer an emptiness to be filled, but a spaciousness to inhabit. The judgment was 6 months old. The funds, after a complex but orderly unwinding of Julian's offshore labyrinths overseen by a receivership, had been transferred. The Vance Tower had been quietly sold, its gleaming base isolators no longer a metaphor for his life, just an engineering feature for the next conglomerate. Julian had settled the SEC charges with a staggering fine and a lifetime ban from serving as an officer of a public company. He'd left California. The spectacle was over. Alina turned from the view. The penthouse was different, not in its structure, but in its essence. The cold, curated museum pieces Julian had favored were gone, sold at auction. In their place were a few carefully chosen things. The worn oak drafting table from her graduate school days, now positioned to catch the northern light, a vibrant, chaotic tapestry from Oaxaca she'd bought on a solo trip last month, a single, perfect specimen of the Romanesque capital, a small bronze cast from the museum's collection. It sat on her desk, a solid, weight-bearing thing. The space was no longer a stage for performance. It was a workshop for a new life. Her phone buzzed, not with legal alerts or frantic calls from intermediaries, but with a calendar reminder. Community board meeting presentation, 10 a.m. She picked up a leather folio, not a manila folder, and slipped a rolled set of plans inside. The hearing room in the basement of the public library was a universe away from Department 518. The air smelled of old books and industrial cleaner. Folding chairs were arranged before a makeshift dais. The attendees were not suited lawyers or gossiping bloggers, but community activists, retired architects, local business owners, and a handful of city planners with weary, hopeful eyes. The topic was the proposed redevelopment of a derelict mid-century municipal building in the Tenderloin into a multi-purpose women's resource center. When Alina was called, she walked to the front, her folio under her arm. She wore a tailored, soft-wool blazer and trousers, the dark navy of deep water. Her hair, once worn in the elegant, subdued style Julian preferred, was now in a simple, loose braid over one shoulder. She unrolled her plans, pinning them to a standing board. They were not the slick, digital renders of a corporate firm, but beautiful, hand-drafted elevations and floor plans, alive with fine pen lines and subtle watercolor washes. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm, carrying easily in the quiet room. "My name is Alina Vance. These are some preliminary concepts for the proposed Athena Center." She gestured to the plans. "The core idea is integration, not isolation. We don't want a fortress, we want a nexus." For the next 20 minutes, she spoke not as a victim, not as a plaintiff, but as an architect, which she realized with a quiet thrill was what she had always been. She pointed out how the design reclaimed the original building's robust concrete skeleton, but opened it up with interior courtyards and glass, flooding the space with light. She showed the layout for the legal aid clinic on the ground floor, open and welcoming. The second floor housed counseling suites and a digital literacy lab. The third was reserved for a subsidized co-working space and a small, secure childcare facility for clients and residents. The roof was a green terrace with vegetable plots. "The goal," she concluded, tracing a line on the plan that connected all the spaces, "is to create a community where a woman can find a lawyer, learn to code, get therapy, and have her children cared for safely, all under one roof. Where the barriers between needs are dissolved by design. Where the foundation is literally and figuratively solid, transparent, and meant to bear the weight of real lives." There were questions about zoning, about funding. Alina answered them with a quiet authority that surprised even her. The funds from the settlement were not for a life of idle luxury. They were the endowment for the Vanceliner Foundation, the primary backer of this project and others like it. The money was no longer a symbol of a battle won. It was a tool for building. After the meeting, an older woman with sharp eyes and a kind face, the head of a local domestic violence shelter, approached her. "These are extraordinary," she said, touching the edge of the watercolor rendering. "You understand. So many designs are about managing poverty. Yours is about fostering wholeness." "That was the idea," Alina said, and for the first time in a public setting, she smiled a true, unburdened smile. Later that afternoon, she met with her small, fierce team at the Foundation's offices, a sunny, converted loft in North Beach. There was Mara, the no-nonsense former family law attorney who ran their legal advocacy program, and Ben, the pragmatic, idealistic operations manager. They were reviewing the website for their newest initiative, the Full Transparency Project. It's a guided toolkit, Alina explained to a visiting reporter from a nonprofit journal. Plain language explainers on financial disclosure in marriage, prenuptial agreements, how to spot coercive terms, how to document contributions, both financial and non-financial. We have templates for personal balance sheets, logs for recording domestic and emotional labor. We're partnering with legal clinics to offer low-cost reviews. She handed the reporter a beautifully designed booklet. The law can feel like a foreign country. We want to give people the map and the passport. This was born from your experience, the reporter stated more than asked. Alina nodded. It was born from the discovery that what I thought was my greatest weakness, my ignorance of the law, was in fact a systemic gap that is exploited. Knowledge shouldn't be a luxury good. Full transparency shouldn't be a clause that gets weaponized. It should be a standard operating procedure for partnership. The reporter left, and Alina sat for a moment in the quiet of her sun-drenched office. She looked at the bronze capital on her desk, then out the window. She thought of the courtroom, the laughter, the single folder, the devastating, silent power of a correctly cited rule. She wasn't that woman anymore. That woman had been a necessary construction, a legal persona as deliberate as one of her architectural drawings. She had been a plaintiff, a warrior, a demolitions expert. That work was done. Now she was a builder. Her phone chimed with a calendar alert for a late afternoon call. It was with a young woman in Ohio, a former teacher who had found the Full Transparency Project online. Her husband, a rising executive, was pressuring her to sign a post-nuptial agreement she didn't understand. She was scared, isolated, and felt stupid. "I'm not like you," the woman had written in her initial plea. "I'm not strong." Alina prepared for the call. She didn't see herself as strong. She saw herself as someone who had learned, the hardest way possible, that the blueprints matter. That you have to read the fine print on the foundation. And that if the foundation is rotten, you don't just live in the crumbling house. You learn the building codes, you secure the site, and you build something new. She took the call, her voice warm and steady. "Hi, Sarah. It's Alina. Thank you for reaching out. You're not alone in this, and you're not stupid. The first thing we're going to do is look at this document together, line by line. I'll be right here with you." As she spoke, guiding Sarah through the intimidating legalese, the final pieces of her old life settled into their new configuration. The victory wasn't the money. It wasn't the public vindication. It was this, the ability to sit in the quiet light of a new day, whole and unbroken, and use the hard-won knowledge of how things fall apart to teach someone else how to build something that would last. The vow she had made to Julian was ashes. But the vow she had made to herself in that courtroom, to turn silence into strategy, knowledge into power, that vow was the cornerstone of everything she now was. And it was a vow she intended to keep, one blueprint, one terrified phone call, one sun-filled community room at a time. The laughter that had once followed her was now a distant echo, drowned out by the sound of her own voice, clear and sure, and the peaceful, purposeful scratch of her pen on a fresh sheet of drafting paper.